In the golden hush of early autumn, deep within Montana's Bitterroot wilderness, something happened that would ripple far beyond the forest floor. A retired carpenter named Walter Grayson was driving his old pickup truck down a narrow trail when he stumbled upon a moment so strange, so quietly powerful, it would leave even the most skeptical hearts in tears.
Near first, it looked like a classic standoff. A bobcat and a moose, frozen mid-path, eyes locked, the woods holding its breath. The kind of scene that might end in a burst of primal fury. But what followed was nothing short of miraculous.
This just a cute animal video. It isn't just about a wild cat or a moose wandering alone. What you're about to witness is a story of trust born out of trauma, of creatures who weren't supposed to love, but did. Of a secret bond between species so rare it defied every natural law we thought we understood. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a grieving old man stood silently, watching, remembering, healing. If you think you've seen it all in the wild, think again.
Because what happened next would change everything. Let's begin. Walter Grayson didn't expect to cry that day. He didn't expect anything.
At 80, his life had settled into predictable rhythms, the kind that make time slip quietly by, like the turning of leaves in early fall. But something ancient stirred in him the moment he turned onto the forest road that morning. The sky was a soft gray blanket. His breath fogged the cracked windshield. His hands, thick from years of carpentry, gripped the steering wheel, not out of necessity, but habit. Everything felt still. The truck groaned as he rounded the bend. He was thinking about Helen again, her laugh, her hands in the garden, the way she'd leave a steaming cup of tea on the windowsill like a sacred ritual. She'd been gone 9 years, but some days the ache returned like she'd just stepped out for a moment.
Near like a ghost summoned by memory, the forest parted, and he saw them.
A bobcat and a moose, standing in the middle of the narrow trail. He hit the brakes instinctively, tires crunching over gravel. For a second he thought it was some kind of illusion. Wildcats and moose don't share ground, let alone space. It was the kind of moment that should have been over in an instant, either with blood, flight, or fury. But instead, they stood there, silent, unmoving, together. Yes, the moose was tall and deliberate, her legs like stone pillars, her gaze soft but unwavering. The bobcat, smaller, coiled like a spring, body rippling with muscle under her spotted coat, seemed no less calm. Walter's mind raced to categorize what he was seeing. A territorial standoff? No. There were no growls, no threat postures, no fight, no fear, just something else. He turned off the engine, heart thudding harder than it had in years. He remembered watching an old wildlife documentary decades ago, the narrator describing a moment when a lion spared a gazelle. A glitch in nature, the voice had said. A rare hesitation in the code. This moment felt exactly like that, but instead of predators sizing up prey, it felt like he wasn't sure. Familiarity? Recognition? The way two old souls meet at a bus stop and nod, as if picking up a conversation from another lifetime. Walter slowly rolled down the window, letting the cool air in. The forest held its breath. The wildcat took a single step forward. The moose didn't flinch. Her ears twitched, but otherwise, she remained rooted. To Walter's absolute disbelief, the moose lowered her great head, deliberate, gentle, and nudged the bobcat's cheek. It wasn't a brush or a bump. It was a mother's gesture, intimate, protective, tender. The bobcat responded in kind, rubbing her face slowly against the moose's muzzle. Walter gasped, an audible sound in the silence, the same way he had when Helen had pressed her forehead to his the day she told him she was sick. That sacred, wordless exchange. He was no scientist, but in that moment, he knew what he was seeing was real. And it wasn't just surprising, it was profound. Blackmail. Could have pulled out his phone, could have captured a cute animal video, one of those wild animal rescue clips that go viral in seconds. Bobcat and moose show affection in the wild. The kind of headline that makes people click and scroll, then forget. But this wasn't that. This wasn't entertainment. This felt sacred. It felt like stumbling into a cathedral when the choir is rehearsing in the dark. You didn't move. He barely breathed. And still they stayed, lost in that moment as if the entire forest had collapsed into their quiet exchange. Then, without a sound, they turned, together. The moose stepped toward the tree line, graceful despite her bulk. The bobcat followed her, trotting beside her flank, not as a predator or rival, but as a companion. Walter watched, stunned, as the two disappeared into the thickets as if they'd done it 100 times before. The road was empty again, but Walter wasn't the same. Nye sat in silence. Long enough for the windshield to fog again. He didn't turn the engine back on, didn't reach for his thermos or the crossword in the passenger seat. Instead, he sat there with one hand on the dash, tears pooling in his eyes. A bobcat and a moose, together. It made no sense, but neither did grief. Neither did love after loss, or joy when you least expect it. Nature, like life, was full of rules, but sometimes something breaks through. A moment, a gesture, a connection that defies every known law. And when it does, it demands attention. Walter stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on gravel, knees stiff, but heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in years. Wonder. He stood at the edge of the trees, staring into the woods where they had vanished. Could he just go home? Pretend it hadn't happened? Helen wouldn't have. She used to follow butterfly trails just to see where they led. Once she'd found a fawn curled under a pine stump and spent an entire afternoon talking to it, never touching, just being there. Sometimes, she told him, witnessing is enough. But other times, she said, you follow. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, slid his old smartphone into his pocket, took a breath, and stepped into the trees. More to see wasn't going to miss it. Sometimes the world gives you a glimpse, a wild cat and a moose in stillness. You can choose to explain it away, file it under oddities, and move on. Or you can lean closer, ask why. Wonder what else you've missed while assuming everything had to follow rules, especially the ones about who is allowed to love whom. We often see nature as a place of cold laws, eat or be eaten. But what if we're wrong? What if, in the deep woods and quiet moments, there are rules we've never documented, rules of compassion, of grief, of alliances forged not by instinct, but by shared experience. In 2019, a wildlife cam in Ontario captured footage of a coyote and a badger traveling together for weeks, an unlikely pair, each benefiting from the other's strengths. It was dubbed mutualism in motion. This felt like that, but deeper, not survival-driven, emotion-driven. Parental, even. Have you ever witnessed something in the wild that didn't make sense but moved you deeply? A moment of peace between animals, a bond you couldn't explain? Share it in the comments. Your story might just be what someone else needs today. Walter didn't know it then, but by following them into the woods, he was stepping into something far greater than a simple mystery. Because what he would find deep in the trees wasn't just a secret between animals. It was a revelation about motherhood, survival, and the quiet, unbreakable bonds that form when two beings decide to protect more than just their own. And so, he followed. Walter hesitated for only a moment. He wasn't the type to go chasing ghosts through the woods, especially not at his age. But what he had seen wasn't a ghost. It was something real, living, and utterly impossible. A bobcat and a moose moving side by side, not in conflict, not in fear, but in what could only be described as trust, maybe even companionship. He switched on the flashlight. Its warm yellow beam swept across the forest edge, catching bits of lichen, loose pine needles, and the deep indentations of hooves. He didn't need a map. He'd hunted these woods as a younger man, walked them with Helen in quieter years. He knew the terrain, the paths deer used, the hidden hollows where foxes denned in spring. But this trail was unfamiliar. The tracks moved deliberately, slow and side by side. The moose's deep prints were easy to follow, pressed like pressed coins into the damp soil. Alongside them were lighter impressions, nearly invisible save for where the bobcat's claws had broken moss or disturbed dry leaves. The spacing suggested something strange. Neither animal was chasing. They were walking, together. Walter followed. Each step forward was a choice, not just toward understanding the mystery, but toward something more personal. He hadn't followed anything in a long time, not since Helen died, not since their daughter moved to Arizona and his days became slow loops of breakfast, bird feeders, and crossword puzzles. But tonight the forest whispered like it used to. The pines swayed with a language older than speech. Every sound, the click of twigs, the rush of far-off creek water, felt amplified, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The bobcat and the moose had walked this path minutes before him, yet it felt like they were still near, watching from between the trees, perhaps waiting. He moved slowly, keeping his flashlight low. His boots made soft crunches in the underbrush. A barred owl called somewhere far above, and the forest answered in hushes and tremors. There was something sacred in the stillness, not the kind you get from being alone, but the kind that happens just before you're allowed to witness something meant to stay hidden. Pieing a stand of spruce, Walter spotted a scuff in the earth, fresh, as if something had lain down there recently. Tufts of dark fur clung to a low-hanging branch. Moose fur. He bent down and found something else. A faint paw print, just a bit smeared. The bobcat must have paused here. He turned off the flashlight for a moment. Darkness enveloped him completely. It wasn't frightening. It was quiet. It reminded him of lying beside Helen on the back porch in the summer of '87, listening to the wind and letting their fingers barely touch. You didn't need to talk then. You just needed to feel someone else's presence. That's what this felt like now, not chasing animals, but following a feeling. He continued deeper. The air grew cooler, more damp. He passed a patch of broken branches and noticed fresh claw marks on a birch tree, too high and ragged to be a bobcat's. His chest tightened. Bare country. He froze, listening. Nothing. Not even the wind now. This was the moment he could have turned back. No one would blame him. But then he noticed something just beyond a rocky slope. A dim glow. Not light, but openness. A clearing. And the trail led directly into it. Pierre Walter crept forward, one step at a time, careful not to break any branches underfoot. When he reached the edge of the clearing, what he saw stopped him cold. Clay. The moose stood sentinel at the far side of the glade, her body calm but alert, watching the tree line beyond. A few feet away, the bobcat lounged against a mossy log, her tail flicking lazily. And in between them were 4 young creatures, 3 bobcat kittens tumbling across fallen leaves, and a moose calf still wobbling on its legs, its coat a shade lighter than its mother's. They weren't just near each other. They were playing. Neil kittens stalked each other through the grass, leapt at shadows, then ran beneath the moose calf's legs, using it like a living jungle gym. The calf, for its part, seemed utterly unbothered, curious even. It nudged one kitten gently with its snout. Another one tried climbing its front leg. The bobcat mother glanced up occasionally, but never interfered. Neither did the moose. Walter's breath caught. This wasn't a chance. This was a structure, intention, an alliance. And suddenly, everything he had seen on the road made sense. Not just a rare moment of affection, but a partnership built over time. These animals knew each other. They had raised their young in tandem. They had chosen to cohabitate. He reached for his phone. His hands trembled slightly, but he managed to record a minute or two of the scene. Not because he wanted to prove it to the world, but because he needed to prove it to himself. That this wasn't a dream, that something sacred could still exist in a world that felt like it had lost all softness. He backed away slowly, heart thudding not with fear, but awe. Later, back in the safety of his cabin, Walter sat in the dark watching the video on loop. He couldn't stop crying. Not big, dramatic sobs, but the kind of quiet weeping that comes from deep inside, when something soft breaks open after years of being hidden. Helen would have believed him. She always said animals knew more than we gave them credit for. She used to talk about the time she saw a deer lead a blind raccoon across a flooded ditch. Said it was one of the holiest things she'd ever seen. Walter stared at the last frame of the video. Moose calf lying beside a bobcat kitten, their bodies gently touching. He whispered aloud, "They're raising them together." He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, writing a letter, not to a friend or family member, but to a wildlife biologist he remembered from over a decade ago, Dr. Eliza Munro. She had once studied mountain lion movement in this region. Back then, she'd called him an honorary ranger because of how well he knew the terrain. He wrote the letter slowly, carefully. Attached is the video, and with his finger hovering over the send button, he thought of Helen again. "You'd follow them too," he said softly. Then he hit send. Not everything wild is violent. Not every predator is cruel. Sometimes the forest has its own quiet arrangements, ones that echo the best of what we hope for in ourselves: connection, protection, and love without condition. The natural world doesn't always obey our assumptions. We think we know its rules: eat, survive, compete. But what if those rules are only part of the picture? What if nature sometimes breaks its own pattern to show us something more profound? In 2021, researchers in Alberta observed a red fox consistently bringing food to an injured badger over 3 days without clear benefit. It was documented, but never fully explained. Compassion, one biologist suggested. Or perhaps just something we don't yet understand. Have you ever seen animals doing something unexpectedly kind? A wild animal helping another. A moment of beauty in nature that changed how you saw the world. Share it below. We'd love to hear your story. Walter thought he had seen the most extraordinary part of the story. But the next day, when Dr. Munro arrived in person, holding back tears as she watched the footage on his old laptop, he realized this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because the truth about this wild animal rescue alliance, and the baby bobcat and moose calf at the center of it, was even more unbelievable than he ever imagined. By the time Dr. Eliza Munro arrived at Walter's cabin the next morning, the coffee had already gone cold, but neither of them noticed. Her hands trembled slightly as she held his phone, watching the video on repeat. A bobcat kitten swatting playfully at a moose calf's ear. The mother bobcat, Vixen, sitting nearby, utterly calm. The moose, Sable, standing tall but relaxed, her eyes soft with something that looked dangerously close to affection. "This can't be real," Eliza whispered. "But it is." Walter didn't say anything. He just nodded, slow and steady, like a man who had waited his entire life to be believed. An hour later, they were back in the woods. Walter led the way, moving carefully along the trail he now knew by heart. Eliza followed close behind, her binoculars swinging at her chest, notebook tucked into her vest. They didn't talk much. The forest had a way of demanding silence when something sacred was near. When they reached the clearing, Walter stopped and raised a hand. They crouched behind a mossy outcrop, hidden by ferns and low branches. Eliza lifted her binoculars, and within seconds, her breath hitched. "They're still here," she murmured. In the middle of the glade, the unthinkable played out like a quiet miracle. Aspen, the moose calf, was lying in the dappled sunlight, his legs folded beneath him like a resting fawn. Nearby, the 3 bobcat kittens tumbled over one another in a chaotic pile of fluff and paws. One leapt into the air and landed awkwardly on Aspen's flank, prompting the calf to twist his neck and gently nuzzle the kitten away. It wasn't annoying, it was affection. Walter watched Eliza carefully. She had gone pale, her eyes glassy. She didn't blink as she scribbled quick notes, then paused to watch again. "This isn't just tolerance," she said. "This is a nursery." The word hung in the air. A wild animal nursery, shared by 2 species that shouldn't even occupy the same space, let alone parent together. Yet here they were, not just surviving, but thriving. Walter didn't have words for it, but what he saw reminded him of the way Helen used to open her arms to the neighbor kids, especially the ones with trouble at home. Their porch had always been a safe zone. There were no rules about bloodlines or boundaries, just a gentle welcome and a warm chair. And that's what this felt like. Each of the bobcat kittens had a personality. Echo, the smallest, preferred to stay close to Vixen, often watching the others play with wide, thoughtful eyes. Nova, bold and brash, was the instigator, leaping onto Aspen's back or darting between the moose's long legs with reckless delight. Pip, the middle kitten, was the peacemaker, often wedging himself between his siblings when things got too rough. Aspen. Aspen had the calm of something far older than his weeks on Earth. He didn't just tolerate the bobcat kittens, he interacted with them, gently, patiently. He'd nudge them upright when they tumbled too hard, let them chew on his ear. Once, when Echo mewed too loudly, Aspen rose and led her back toward Vixen, who licked the kitten's head before settling again. A baby bobcat and a moose calf learning to move, eat, and play together, under the eyes of 2 mothers who clearly understood each other. "Me-seasoned behavioral coincidence," Eliza said softly. "This is social bonding, maybe even emotional modeling." Walter turned toward her. "So what do we call it?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. It's like nature forgot its own rules." Sometimes what we call impossible is simply what we haven't witnessed yet. The laws of nature may be rigid, but life has a funny way of bending the edges, especially where motherhood is concerned. What matters most, in the wild or in our own lives, is not who shares our blood, but who chooses to stay and protect us. We assume the forest operates on instinct alone, territory, hunger, fear, but what if some parts of it run on something more? What if trust and affection aren't limited to our species? What if wild animal rescue doesn't always come from humans, but from each other? In Yellowstone, a park ranger once recorded a black bear adopting an abandoned mountain lion cub. Though the relationship didn't last long, it proved a point. Maternal instinct can override species. It may not be common, but it's real. What Walter and Eliza were witnessing here, however, wasn't a temporary aberration. It was a stable structure, a bond that had held long enough for young animals to grow around it, to treat each other as siblings. As the hours passed, the 2 observers remained hidden. They watched the group rotate in rhythm. When Vixen rose to scout the edges of the glade, Sable moved closer to the kittens. When Aspen wandered too far, Vixen barked sharply, and he returned without hesitation. Eliza's voice dropped lower. "This is coordinated." Walter nodded. "They take turns." "It's like co-parenting," she whispered, "but across species." The word co-parenting felt absurd, and yet it fit. Perhaps both mothers had lost something. Perhaps they had found each other in a moment of crisis, when a common enemy had forced them into shared space. But what had begun as necessity had grown into something more enduring, something more beautiful. Eliza snapped a photo quietly, then lowered the camera. Her eyes were red. "I can't believe I'm saying this," she said, "but I think they've created a family." Walter swallowed hard. "Then we protect it." Have you ever built a family that didn't come from your blood? A friendship, a guardianship, a bond that grew in the unlikeliest place? Share your story in the comments. Maybe, like these animals, you found kinship where no one expected it. As the sun dipped below the trees, and the clearing bathed in golden light, the kittens curled beside Aspen, their tiny forms pressed into his warm side. Vixen lay on one end, Sable on the other, their bodies like sentinels. Peer you'd expect in a children's storybook, not in the wild woods of Montana. But it was real. And Eliza, for all her training and scientific rigor, was now a believer in things science hadn't yet named. She turned to Walter. "I think there's a reason you were the one who saw them." Walter smiled, just barely. "Maybe I was supposed to remember something I forgot." And he had. He remembered how fragile life could be, how powerful love was when freely given, and he remembered how easy it was to feel alone, until something found you in the dark and chose to stay. But the forest, as gentle as it seemed that day, still held dangers, and the past that brought Vixen and Sable together was not done testing them, because sometimes, to truly understand what makes a bond unbreakable, you must witness it being threatened. And when the bear returned, everything they had built would hang in the balance. The sun was barely up when Walter stepped onto his porch the next morning and found Eliza sitting on the steps, coffee mug in one hand, her laptop balanced on her knees. Her eyes were puffy. She hadn't slept. She didn't look at him as she spoke, played out all night reviewing old field reports, trail cam logs, and local wildlife alerts. "Walter, I think I know how this started." He didn't interrupt. He just sat beside her and waited, like he'd done for Helen in the final months, when words came hard and silence meant more. "There was a fire," Eliza said. "Late spring, West Ridge. Burned over 500 acres. That was Vixen's territory. She was collared 3 years ago, remember? She had a mate, and last season she was tracked with a den of 4. After the fire, the man disappeared. So did one of the kits. Unloaded nodded slowly. "That's why she moved east." "Likely," Eliza replied. "And Sable, the moose, she was spotted with twins last year, but only one calf survived. A ranger filed a report in June. He found grizzly prints near the carcass." Lane finally looked up at Walter. "They both lost children, Walter. They both lost family." The forest hadn't brought them together for beauty or whimsy. It had forced them into each other's path by way of pain. Shared trauma. That was the glue. Maybe it began with a silent truce. 2 grieving mothers with nothing left to lose. Maybe it started as a necessity. Safety in numbers. A wildcat couldn't fend off a grizzly, but she could see danger coming long before it reached them. A moose couldn't catch a rabbit for dinner, but she could clear a path through deep snow or shield a small body from the cold. And over time, what began as survival had become something else, something deeper. The wildcat and the moose had built a family, a sanctuary, a shared nursery of healing, an unlikely bond born in the ashes of loss. That morning, as they hiked back toward the glade, Walter walked more slowly, not from age, but reverence. He imagined how it might have looked. Vixen watching her mate go silent in the smoke, Sable nudging a lifeless calf, trying to will it back to breath. He had stood in that same fire once, when Helen passed. He remembered the months that followed, how every room in the house felt too loud and too empty at the same time, how even birdsong could make him cry. He never talked about it, just watered the plants and fed the birds, and kept on. Niall, seeing Sable and Vixen shoulder the weight together, he realized something he hadn't before. Maybe grief doesn't have to be carried alone. Not in the forest, not in life. As they reached the glade, Eliza whispered, "They're repositioning." Command Sable and Vixen were standing close, heads low, their bodies angled slightly toward the tree line. Aspen stood behind his mother's legs, ears twitching. The kittens had vanished into the underbrush. The air had changed, tense, expectant. Then came the sound, a low grunt, heavy footfalls. From the far side of the clearing, a large shadow moved behind the trees. A bear. Walter tensed. Eliza crouched lower, slowly raising her binoculars. "Male," she murmured. "Adult. Probably the same one from the June report." Chlorosis went still. Sable took one step forward, hooves sinking into the loam. Vixen didn't move, but her body was coiled, every muscle alert. Then, the bear appeared, massive, lumbering, hungry. Olish felt the old ache in his chest. Not fear for himself, fear for them. The family he hadn't meant to care so much about. A baby bobcat, a moose calf. They didn't stand a chance alone. But they weren't alone. Vixen let out a guttural chuff, and from the shadows, all three kittens darted to the base of a tree, scrambling up with remarkable speed. Aspen huddled closer to Sable's flank. Then, without warning, Sable stepped forward and charged. It wasn't a bluff. The bear reared back, startled. Sable bellowed, loud and deep, her head swinging in defense. The bear swiped once, wide and half-hearted, then turned and lumbered back into the trees, vanishing into silence. A full minute passed. Then Vixen emerged. Her tail twitched once. She walked slowly toward Sable, not in fear but in acknowledgement. The two stood side by side again. Walter exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. They knew exactly what to do. Eliza nodded. That wasn't instinct. That was coordination, communication, trust. And it was in that moment, watching a bobcat and a moose stand together like sentinels, that Walter understood the full truth. This wasn't a temporary alliance. This was a living system, a bond forged in fire and solidified through danger, a pact between survivors. Pain is often the birthplace of connection. Whether in a cabin or a clearing, the deepest bonds are rarely built in comfort. They're formed in the moments when everything falls apart and someone, even a stranger, chooses to stand beside you. We often think animals operate only on instinct, eat, protect, flee. But trauma rewrites the rules, even in the wild. What if animals remember loss? What if they grieve? What if they seek safety not just for survival, but to feel something that resembles peace? In British Columbia, researchers observed a wolf pack fostering an orphaned coyote pup, a species they'd typically chase off or kill. The pup grew with the pack, hunted with them, and was protected for over a year. Some called it an anomaly. Others called it empathy. Russell simply called it family. As they hiked back that evening, the forest quieted around them. The danger had passed, for now, but the feeling lingered, a strange mix of awe and responsibility. At the cabin, Walter sat by the window as dusk settled. He watched the trees swaying in the breeze, wondering what else the woods were trying to teach him. Eliza, at the kitchen table, was already typing up her first report. She looked up suddenly. "What if we're wrong about everything?" "About what?" Walter asked. "About what animals are capable of. About how they feel. Maybe we've only scratched the surface." Walter thought for a moment. Then he said, "Or maybe they're just waiting for us to slow down long enough to notice." Anything that you saw around, without inactuals, without needs. My bear encounter would mark a turning point, not just for the animals, but for Walter and Eliza. Because what they witnessed next in the following days wasn't just proof of survival. It was a masterclass in strategy, mutual care, and the deep intelligence hidden within the wild. And it all began with food. It had been 3 quiet days since the first bear encounter. The glade, once tense, had returned to its gentle rhythm, Vixen stretching lazily under the birch, Sable stripping bark for Aspen, the bobcat kittens wrestling in the moss like wind-up toys.
Eliza had set up a long-distance camera disguised in brush, and Walter returned every morning to watch from afar, coffee in hand, hope in his chest. But the forest never stays still for long. On the 4th day, just after dawn, the warning signs returned.
First came the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the charged, unnatural stillness where even birds seemed to hold their breath. Then Aspen pressed himself close to Sable's leg, his ears twitching violently. Echo darted under a log. Nova and Pip froze mid-play, tails puffed. Vixen crouched low, eyes fixed on the far side of the clearing. Walter, watching through binoculars from the ridge, muttered, "He's back. Unlock." Larger this time. Hungrier. It emerged slowly from the shadows, sniffing the air with sharp purpose. Its fur was darker than before, matted with dirt, its shoulders swaying with weight and intention. This wasn't curiosity. This was predation. Sable let out a deep, resonant snort, stamping one hoof. Vixen didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to the kittens and released a soft, specific chuff. It wasn't panic, it was a command. Within seconds, all 3 kittens bolted, not in chaos, but with precision. Nova and Pip climbed the same pine they had used before. Echo darted under the log again, then doubled back toward the thick fern line. Walter blinked. "They've practiced this." Eliza nodded, scribbling notes. "It's coordinated like a drill." And something remarkable happened. Sable positioned herself between the bear and the tree where Aspen stood. She held her ground, not charging yet, but squared and massive. At the same time, Vixen circled behind the bear, silent as a shadow, slipping between ferns with shocking grace. The bear advanced a few steps, rising onto its hind legs. Sable didn't move. She was a statue of strength. And then the bobcat struck. It's not to attack, but to distract. Vixen darted out from the side and let out a guttural hiss, loud and sharp, then vanished into the underbrush again. The bear turned, snarled, but she was already gone. Sable seized the moment. Knee charged, not recklessly, but with calculated force. Her front hooves pounded the ground, her head lowered. The bear didn't expect it. It stumbled back, roaring, then made a half-hearted swipe before turning toward the tree line. And just like that, it was over. The bear disappeared. The glade stilled. The forest breathed again. Eliza lowered her binoculars. They executed a defense maneuver. That wasn't luck. Walter stared at her. "You think they planned it?" "I think they rehearsed it." She gestured toward the kittens who were now descending the pines, slow and calm. Aspen had moved out from behind his mother and was gently nuzzling Vixen's leg. "They're not panicked. They're not running. They trust each other." Skinny family isn't just about warmth, it's about protection. And not the kind that shows up when things are easy, but the kind that's willing to stand between danger and the ones who can't defend themselves. Sometimes love means becoming a wall. We often assume wild animals act alone, that they're selfish survivors, driven by instinct. But what if we've underestimated them? What if they create systems, teams, even strategies? What if wild animal rescue doesn't always come from humans, but from within the forest itself? In 2018, researchers in Alaska documented a group of caribou and Arctic foxes operating in shared proximity. The caribou used foxes' dens for thermal shelter, while foxes remained alert for predators. When danger came, the animals didn't scatter randomly. They moved in organized, mutual lines. That level of coordination has only recently begun to be understood. Walter wasn't a scientist, but he didn't need data to know what he saw. This wasn't survival by accident. It was survival by trust. And trust, in the wilderness, is the rarest form of currency. Back at the cabin that evening, Eliza was quiet. Her hands moved methodically over her keyboard, but her face was far away.
Walter brewed tea, set a mug beside her, then sat across the table. "I used to think animals didn't remember pain," she said. "That they reacted but didn't carry it the way we do." She glanced up. "But now, I think they might carry it differently. Not by holding it, but by transforming it." Walter thought for a long moment. "You mean like turning fear into instinct?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Like turning loss into loyalty. Like Vixen and Sable, they don't just survive together. They trust each other with their children. That's more than instinct. That's forgiveness, renewal." He thought of Helen again, how she used to say that even grief could be a kind of home if someone sat with you in it. Maybe that's what Sable and Vixen had built. Not just shelter from a bear, but a home, a shared one, built on mutual wounds, mutual strength, and the deep, quiet understanding that they were better together. Have you ever stood in front of danger, not just for yourself, but for someone else? Have you ever found courage you didn't know you had, because someone needed you to? Share your story. Number 4. Ifted. Like these wild creatures, we all carry hidden strength, and sometimes your story gives someone else the courage to stand too. The next day, Eliza installed 2 more cameras around the glade, careful not to disrupt the area. Walter brought apples and left them on a fallen log, far from the nursery zone, curious to see what the animals would do with shared food. What they saw shocked them again. Vixen arrived first, sniffing the apples. She didn't eat. Instead, she sat and waited. Moments later, Sable approached. She sniffed the fruit, then ate one, slowly, deliberately. Only then did Vixen begin to chew on a smaller one. "They're regulating resource access," Eliza said. "That's deliberate." Vixen waited. Walter nodded. She deferred. "It's hierarchy, sure," Eliza continued, "but it's also respect." Walter tilted his head. "You ever seen that before?" Eliza hesitated. "Not across species." They watched as Aspen and the kittens approached, cautious but comfortable. Aspen nosed at one apple, then nudged a piece toward Pip. Pip batted it with his paw, then finally bit into the soft fruit. They were sharing. What began as a defensive alliance was now revealing something deeper, a system of mutual care, resource sharing, and behavioral adaptation. But how far could that go? Could animals who once lived solitary lives truly build a cooperative future? Eliza had a theory, but the only way to test it was to keep watching, and what she would uncover next would shake the foundations of behavioral science itself. The next morning, Walter found Eliza sitting at the table surrounded by open field guides, hand-scribbled notes and diagrams. She didn't even look up when he set a mug of coffee next to her. She was sketching something that looked like a triangle, with moose, bobcat, and offspring labeled at each corner. "You know what this is?" she asked softly. Walter took a sip, glanced down, then shrugged. "Looks like a school project." She smiled without humor. "It's mutualism, not the textbook kind, not clownfish and anemones. This is something new, something layered." She turned the page. "I've seen interspecies tolerance, even temporary cooperation. But what we are seeing here, it's a full-scale behavioral adaptation. Food sharing, role distribution, conflict avoidance, even parental alignment." Walter blinked. "In English?" Eliza leaned back. "It means Vixen and Sable aren't just tolerating each other. They've built a working system, a kind of wild family unit that does more than survive. It functions." That morning, they returned to the clearing once again. The glade was alive with quiet movement. Aspen and Pip were chasing each other around a fallen log. Echo stalked something imaginary under the moss. Nova attempted to climb Sable's leg like a furry sapling, only to be gently nudged off by the calf's massive nose. Eliza whispered, "Watch how they interact."
Walter nodded. The moose lets them climb on her. That's not instinct. It's learned behavior, Eliza confirmed. And look, Vixen doesn't interrupt. That's trust. More than that, it's co-regulation. She's not just aware of where her kittens are. She's confident the moose is helping. They sat in silence, absorbing what they'd once thought impossible. A bobcat and a moose, co-parenting in rhythm. Vixen offered stealth, agility, and heightened senses. Sable offered size, strength, and a calm that grounded the entire dynamic. When danger came, Vixen was the early warning system. When comfort was needed, Sable provided the wall of safety. Each mother filled the other's gaps. Each child learned to navigate both worlds. That afternoon, Eliza finally sat Walter down with her laptop and showed him comparison footage. "Watch this," she said, clicking open a video from a study in Tanzania. This is a case of a zebra foal being raised alongside a baby wildebeest, left orphaned after a flash flood. They didn't form a unit, not really. They just moved in together for a few days. Eventually, they separated. Then she clicked another file. Now, this one is from Eastern Russia. A brown bear and a wolf were captured, sharing kills over several months. But again, no joint offspring, no shared den, just a temporary alliance built on need. She paused, then tapped on the screen. But this is something else. Walter, we're looking at cross-species maternal behavior. A moose is allowing bobcat kittens to nest beside her calf? A bobcat brings food into a territory where a prey animal lives, and not consume it alone. That's unheard of. Walter frowned. Is it wild animal rescue, or something else entirely? Eliza exhaled slowly. It's cooperative symbiosis, but emotionally driven. These aren't just biological checklists. These are choices. Sometimes survival pushes living beings to adapt, but sometimes it pushes them to grow. True strength isn't just in standing alone. It's in recognizing what we lack and choosing to trust someone else to help carry it. Science likes clean definitions. Predator, prey, solitary, social, but the natural world rarely fits into neat boxes. What if we've missed hundreds of these bonds simply because we weren't looking? Or worse, because we didn't believe they were possible? What if the forest is full of relationships we haven't yet earned the patience to witness? In 2020, a group of researchers in South Dakota recorded a wild turkey caring for a litter of orphaned raccoon kits. She led them away from predators, allowed them to sleep near her, and made vocalizations previously undocumented in turkeys. While the bond lasted only weeks, it opened a new door in ethology, proving that maternal instinct may leap across species under extreme conditions. What Walter and Eliza saw, however, was more than maternal instinct. It was an enduring structure. It had a rhythm, a pulse, a system. That evening, they observed a new pattern. Vixen returned with a squirrel, fresh kill. She dropped it on the edge of the glade, then backed away. Moments later, Sable approached, not to eat, but to nudge it forward with her nose toward the kittens. Then Aspen picked at a nearby branch. The moment wasn't about hunger. It was about provision. Eliza was stunned. They're training their young. Walter nodded. They're practicing. And they're doing it in front of each other? Well, this isn't just behavioral. This is cultural. He raised an eyebrow. Animals have culture? She smiled. Some do. Elephants mourn their dead. Orcas pass down hunting strategies for generations. Crows teach tool use. And now, maybe moose and bobcats can share values too. The words felt ridiculous as they left her mouth, but not in that moment, not after everything they'd seen. What began as a wild cat and the moose facing off in the woods had evolved into a living experiment in interspecies cooperation. Have you ever formed an unlikely partnership? Maybe someone you never expected to trust became part of your journey. Maybe you built something together, despite every difference, because you both believed in something larger. Tell us below. Like Sable and Vixen, your story might prove that sometimes The best families are the ones we choose. Later that night, as Walter cleaned his old binoculars and Eliza finished her notes, they shared a quiet cup of tea. The stove crackled. The night outside was gentle. "You think it'll last?" Walter asked. Eliza stared at the steam curling from her mug.
"I don't know. The wild doesn't promise permanence, but this has already lasted longer than anything I've ever seen."
Walter smiled. Helen would have called it a miracle. Eliza didn't reply, but she reached across the table and placed her hand on his, wan, steady. "You're part of it now, too," she said, "whether you like it or not." But even as Sable and Vixen continued to nurture their shared brood, and as Eliza documented every new behavior with awe, something deeper was beginning to stir inside Walter. A realization not just about animals, but about himself. Because while he had come to the forest to witness a mystery, he would soon discover that the greatest transformation wasn't happening in the glade. It was happening in his own heart. Young Walter stood at the edge of the clearing, binoculars dangling forgotten at his side. The soft evening wind carried the scent of pine and moss, but also something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. Down below, Aspen lay curled in a bed of soft grass, his long legs folded delicately beneath him. The 3 bobcat kittens were piled beside him, one stretched across his back, another gently chewing the tuft of his tail. Sable and Vixen sat opposite one another like mirrored guardians, relaxed but alert, their bodies forming a protective ring around their young. A moose and a bobcat, wild animals that had every reason to distrust each other. Yet here they were, living, thriving, choosing connection over instinct. Walter couldn't help but wonder, what if humans lived like this? The question echoed in his chest. That night, back at the cabin, Walter didn't go straight to sleep. He found himself sitting at the table long after Eliza had turned in. In front of him lay a notebook, open to a blank page. He wrote just one sentence. "They don't speak the same language, but they understand each other better than most people do." Then he closed the notebook and just sat there, letting the quiet wrap around him like an old quilt. The next morning, Eliza brought in news. "I've been reviewing comparative behavior studies, cases of interspecies empathy. It's always rare, but it happens. Dolphins pushing drowning dogs to shore, elephants lifting injured antelope calves. Even a lioness that adopted baby oryx in Kenya protected them until she starved." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Why'd she starve?" "She wouldn't hunt while they were nearby, wouldn't break the illusion of peace. Like she was trying to be something she wasn't because she needed to believe in love more than survival." He went quiet for a long while. Eliza sat beside him. "You okay?" Walter took a breath. "I used to think grief made you harder, less likely to trust. But maybe it just makes you listen better, if you let it." That afternoon, he sat alone on a bench they'd built overlooking the glade. A warm sun fell through the trees. The animals moved in rhythm below, grooming, playing, resting. It struck him that no one was trying to win. No one was dominating, correcting, or withdrawing. They simply adapted to each other's differences, filled in each other's gaps. Like Helen did for him. Nia had always been the better listener, the patient is one. When Walter's temper got the better of him in his younger years, she never argued back. She waited. Then later, over tea, she'd say, "There's always a reason, Walt, and there's always a choice." He never really understood what she meant. Not until now, because that's what Vixen and Sable had done. They'd chosen to trust, to stay, to share, not out of naivety, but out of necessity, and perhaps out of love. Love, real, unspoken love, isn't about sameness. It's about remaining beside someone, especially when you don't understand them fully. It's choosing presence over perfection, like a wildcat curling beside a moose, not because it makes sense, but because it feels safe. If wild animals, creatures driven by survival, can choose to nurture instead of attack, to share space instead of fight for it, what excuse do we have? What would happen if we, like them, saw vulnerability not as weakness, but as an invitation? Maybe that's the heart of compassion. Knowing someone else's pain without needing it to match your own. A few years back, Walter had read a story in a small-town newspaper. A man who'd lost his wife adopted a pit bull on death row. The dog was blind, aggressive, and no one wanted her. But he said she reminded him of himself. Broken, misunderstood, but still alive. Within 6 months, the dog was calm, trusting, and even playful. They healed together. Walter dismissed the story at the time. Too sentimental, he thought. But now, he wasn't so sure. Maybe sentiment was just another word for truth. We don't want to feel too deeply. The forest had become a teacher. Every moment he observed this unlikely alliance, Walter felt something in himself rearrange. He no longer saw Bobcat and Moose. He saw patience, humility, forgiveness. Things he hadn't shown his daughter in years. Things he hadn't shown himself. He thought of Sarah, how they hadn't spoken properly since Helen's funeral, how the silence had stretched between them like winter. Quiet, brittle, empty. Maybe it was time to close the distance. He reached for his phone. His fingers hovered for a long while before he typed, "I saw something in the forest that reminded me of you and Mom. Call when you can. I miss you." He hit send before he could overthink it. Then he looked out toward the glade where Sable was resting her massive head gently on the earth, and Vixen sat close by, her eyes closing under the afternoon sun. Their children, wild, chaotic, perfect, tangled together in sleep. Has nature ever taught you something about being human? A moment where an animal's action made you rethink how you show love or how you receive it? Share your story below. Sometimes, the simplest gestures carry the most profound truths. That evening, as twilight fell over the treetops and the animals disappeared into shadows, Walter sat with Eliza on the porch. "You think they'll stay like this forever?" he asked. Nysa shook her head. "Nature doesn't promise forever, but it promises now." He smiled. "Then I think I'm ready to live more in now." The forest hummed softly in response. But as the glade grew quieter each evening and the shadows lengthened with the turning season, Walter knew something else was shifting, not just in the animals, but in himself. Because some stories are too powerful to keep. Some moments are meant to be passed on. And as the forest whispered its final lesson, Walter began to understand. This wasn't just their story anymore. It was his too. Wilmington, till the final morning. Walter woke before the birds. The cabin was quiet. The world outside still held in the grey hands of dawn, but inside him something had changed. He sat at the table with a mug of tea, not touching it, staring at the notebook Eliza had given him 2 days earlier. The cover was worn now, pages filled with his uneven handwriting, notes, thoughts, questions, and one sentence he'd underlined 3 times. "We are not so different." That phrase had followed him all week, through every moment in the glade. Every time Aspen shared space with the Bobcat kitten, or Vixen let Sable lean close without flinching. These weren't just wild instincts. These were quiet decisions made in the absence of fear, the kind that form the root of all true animal companionship, even in the wild. He didn't want to forget this, didn't want the memory to fade like a strange dream. And more than that, he didn't want anyone else to miss the message hidden inside what looked, on the surface, like another cute animal video. So, Walter made a decision. He would share it. Afternoon, while Eliza hiked to replace batteries in the camera traps, Walter sat down at his old computer, the one Sarah had insisted he'd keep, even after he swore he'd never use it again. Nia opened his email, pulled up the video clips Eliza had transferred from her field cameras, and carefully pieced together a short highlight reel. Aspen, nuzzling Pip. Vixen is pacing beside Sable. The bear encounter. The shared apple. No narration, no edits, just truth. He uploaded the file to a cloud folder, then wrote a simple note. This isn't fiction. This happened in the Bitterroot Mountains. A bobcat and a moose shared parenting. Their young played together. They defended each other. They built something sacred, and I believe it should be seen. Maybe it will help someone remember who they are. Walter Grayson. Then he sent it to a nature documentary filmmaker he'd found online, someone who specializes in wild animal rescue stories. And, because he figured, why not, he uploaded it to YouTube himself. He didn't expect much. But by the next morning, his inbox had over 300 unread messages. The video spread quickly. At first, people watched in disbelief. A moose and a bobcat, they wrote, "This has to be fake." But the footage was too raw, too unfiltered. There was no forced drama, no narration, just real interaction between species, real tenderness, real animal rescue, but not from humans, from each other. By the end of the week, animal rescue channels, wildlife forums, and even parenting blogs were talking about it. Not just because it was surprising, but because it felt healing. Walter didn't care about the numbers. He cared about the comments. People wrote things like, "This made me call my sister after 5 years. I never knew bobcats could be this gentle. I'm crying. These wild cat babies act more lovingly than half the people I know." Is this what we've lost? The instinct to protect what's not ours just because it needs protecting? Some shared memories of lost pets. Others spoke of loneliness, of remembering that the world still had softness if you looked long enough. In Walter, that was enough. He became known, at least to a quiet corner of the internet, as the keeper of the glade. Eliza laughed when someone mailed him a mug with those words printed in green letters. But Walter didn't laugh. He felt the weight of it, not as a title, as a responsibility. He began writing weekly updates, quiet reflections, a mixture of memory and moment. He didn't try to explain the science. That was Eliza's job. But he spoke of what it felt like to witness a wild animal rescue that didn't come from trucks or tranquilizers, but from empathy. He wrote about what it taught him, what it returned to him. Nee even wrote about Helen. One afternoon, as he sat by the window, Sarah called. Her voice was soft. "I saw the video, Dad." He waited. "It was beautiful," she said. They didn't speak of what they'd missed, years of silence, misunderstanding. Instead, they spoke of animals. Of how Sarah had watched the footage every night that week. Of how her daughter had named one of her stuffed animals Vixen, because she's the brave one. Walter cried after the call, not because it hurt, but because the walls had finally fallen. We don't have to be the same to love one another. We don't have to agree on everything to protect what matters. If a moose can raise a bobcat's kittens and a wildcat can sit guard beside a moose calf, then surely we, humans with words and choices and homes, can learn to do the same. Compassion isn't a privilege of a species, it's a practice. And the wild is full of teachers. The bond between Vixen and Sable isn't just emotional, it's an ecological marvel. What scientists now call facultative interspecies parental symbiosis is rare, but not impossible. These moments, though undocumented until now in North America, prove that adaptation isn't just physical, it's relational. When threats increase, be it predators, fires, or habitat collapse, species will occasionally form cross-species survival units. What makes this case unique is the emotional depth and behavioral stability. The bobcat and moose didn't just coexist, They thrived together. We often think cute animal videos are just for entertainment, but maybe, behind the fluff and the fur, they're mirrors, reminding us of how far we've wandered from tenderness, of how badly we all need to witness animal companionship that defies rules, that shows us not how animals survive, but how they choose to care. Because somewhere deep down, we're still part of that same forest. If you're still here listening to this little bobcat's journey, thank you. If you'd like to help support stories like hers, that little super thanks down there goes a long way. If the story touched something in you, if the sight of a bobcat kitten curled beside a moose calf reminded you of what we could be, then don't let it fade when the video ends. Hit like if you believe compassion can cross every boundary. Subscribe to join us in telling more stories that heal instead of harm. And if you've ever seen something in nature, a moment of peace, of connection, of rescue, leave a comment below. You never know who needs to read it today, because sometimes what saves us isn't louder noise. It's a whisper from the woods saying, "You're not alone."